The Satanic Mill by Otfried Preussler, the second year, 3, Long Live Augustus. The miller's men did not give Leishiko a thrashing. Instead, they left him severely alone. No one spoke to him. No one answered when he asked a question. Juro gave him his oatmeal and his soup in a separate bowl. "You can't expect anyone to share the same dish as a rat," he said. Crabbit agreed. Anyone who told tales on his comrades to the master deserved to be ostracized. At the next new moon, when the good man drove up with his sacks to be ground, the miller had to lend a hand again. He worked very hard as if to show his men what work really meant, or was it more to impress the good man? The master was away a good deal in the latter part of the winter, sometimes going on horseback, sometimes taking the sleigh. The men did not know what kind of business he was about, and they did not trouble their heads about it. They had no need to know what didn't concern them, and what they didn't know would do them no harm. One evening near St. Joseph's Day, when the snow had melted and it was raining hard, so that the miller's men thought themselves lucky to be sitting in the dry. In such vile weather, the master suddenly ordered his traveling carriage, saying he had to go out on important business and it was urgent. Crabbit helped Petar put the 2 bay horses into the shafts, and then held the near horse by the bridle and soothed him, while Petar ran back into the house to tell the master the carriage was ready. Crabbit led the team out to the front yard of the mill. He had flung a horse blanket over his head to keep the rain off, and he put a couple of rugs out for the master too, in case they were wanted. The carriage was a light one, open at the front. The master came striding out, followed by Petar with a storm lantern. He was wearing a voluminous cloak and his black 3-cornered hat. Spurs clinked on his boots, and a dagger stuck out under his cloak. "This is crazy," thought Crabbit as the master settled himself in the box. "Does he have to go out in weather like this?" The master, who had wrapped himself in the rags, asked Crabbit casually, Would you like to come?" "Me?" "You wanted to know why I was going out, didn't you?" Crabbit's curiosity was stronger than his disinclination to get wet. He was up on the box beside the master in a twinkling. "Now let's see if you can drive." So saying, the miller handed him the reins and whip. "We must be in Dresden within the hour." "Dresden? In the hour?" Crabbit could not believe his ears. "Off we go. Drive on," cried the miller. They rattled down the bumpy path through the woods. It was pitch dark, like driving through a stovepipe. "Faster," the master urged him. "Can't you drive faster?" "I'll upset the carriage if I do, master." "Nonsense. Hand me the reins." And the master drove on himself. How he drove! Out of the wood he went like the wind, and on to the high road of commons. Clinging to his seat, Crabbit had to brace his feet against the footboard. The rain whipped his face, and the wind they made almost swept him out of the carriage. It had turned misty, and they were racing into the mist. It wrapped itself around them, but before long their heads rose above it, and it sank lower and lower until it lingered only around the horses' fetlocks. It had stopped raining, and the moon was shining, but the ground was still veiled in mist, a broad expanse of silvery white like snow. Were they going across country? Crabbit could hear no sound of hooves or clatter of wheels. The jolting and rattling of the carriage had stopped some time ago. He felt as if they were driving over a carpet or soft snow or down. The horses stepped out with a smooth, springing stride. It was a joy to drive over the rolling moor in the moonlight like this. Suddenly there was a jolt that made every joint in the carriage creak. Had they run into a tree stump? A curbstone? What would they do if the shaft was broken or one of the wheels? "I'll just get out and look." Crabbit already had a foot on the running board when the master seized hold of him and pulled him back. "Stay where you are." He pointed down. The mists had parted. Crabbit could hardly believe his eyes. Down below him lay the ridge of a roof, and below that a graveyard. Crosses and grave mounds cast their shadows in the moonlight. "We're stuck on the Commons church." "We're stuck on the Commons church tower," said the master. "Mind you don't fall out of the carriage." He tugged at the reins and cracked his whip. "Gee up there." Another jolt, and the carriage was afloat in the air again. They went on their way without any more incidents, driving fast and silently through the air over white clouds gleaming in the moonlight. "And I took them for mist," thought Crabbit. The clock of the royal chapel was striking 9:30 when Krabbit and the master reached Dresden. With a creak, the carriage settled on the paved forecourt of the castle. A groom came running up and took the reins. "Same as usual, sir." "What a stupid question." The master threw the man a coin and then jumped down from the carriage, telling Krabbit to follow him into the castle. They hurried up the steps leading to the gate. At the top, an officer barred their way. He was tall as a tree, wearing a broad silk sash, and the moonlight shone on his breastplate. "Give me the password." Instead of answering, the master pushed him aside. The officer put his hand on his dagger to draw it, but he could not. With a snap of his fingers, the master had rooted him to the spot. And there the tall man stood, stiff as a poker, his eyes opened wide, his hand on the hilt of his dagger. "Come along," said the master. "That fellow must be new here." Inside the gateway, they hurried up a flight of marble stairs, and then through halls and passageways, past walls lined with mirrors and windows, with heavy gold-patterned hangings. The doorkeepers and lackeys they met all seemed to know the master, for no one barred their way or stopped them to question them. They all stood silently aside, bowed, and let the master and Krabbit pass. Ever since they had entered the castle, Krabbit had felt he was dreaming. He was overwhelmed by so much magnificence, by all the brilliance and grandeur around him, and he felt he must look terribly shabby in his miller's smock. "Are the lackeys all laughing at me?" he wondered. "Are the doorkeepers turning up their noses behind my back?" He felt something trip him, and he stumbled. What was this? Why, there was a sword between his feet, tripping him. Whose sword, for goodness sake? A glance at the nearest mirror stopped him in his tracks. He couldn't understand it. He was wearing a black military tunic with silver buttons, tall leather boots, and a sword belt with a rapier in it. Was that a three-cornered hat on his head? Since when did he wear a white powdered bagwig? He opened his mouth to cry, "Master, what's all this? What does it mean?" But he never uttered the words, for just then they came into a candlelit anteroom where several gentlemen were standing. Army captains and colonels and courtiers, with stars and ribbons of their orders on their breasts. A chamberlain approached the master. "Thank heaven you're here at last," he said. "The elector is waiting for you." "You are not alone?" he added, pointing at Krabbit. "My squire," said the master. "He can wait here." The chamberlain beckoned to one of the captains. "Will you look after the gentleman's squire, sir?" Taking Krabbit's arm, the captain guided him to a small table in one of the alcoves by the windows. "Will you take wine or chocolate, my dear sir?" Krabbit decided on a glass of red wine, and as the captain and he drank to each other's health, the master entered the elector's own state apartments. "Let's hope he succeeds," said the captain. "Succeeds in what?" asked Krabbit. "Why, surely you must know. You're his squire. Hasn't your master been trying to convince the elector for weeks that his highness's councillors, who want us to make peace with Sweden, are nothing but fools, and he ought to send them packing?" "Yes, of course," said Krabbit hastily, although he had no notion of any of this. The captains and colonels standing by laughed and drank a toast. "To the war with Sweden," they cried, "and may the elector decide to go on with it. Victory or defeat, but the war with Sweden must go on." It was nearly midnight when the master came back, conducted to the threshold of the anteroom by the elector himself. "We thank you," said the elector. "Your counsel is most valuable to us, as you well know, and though it has taken some time to open our mind to all your reasons and arguments, the decision is now made. The war goes on." The gentlemen in the anteroom rattled their swords and waved their hats in the air. "Long live Augustus!" they cried. "Glory to his highness, the elector, and death to the Swedes!" The elector of Saxony, a heavy, fleshy man of gigantic build, with the muscles of a blacksmith and fists worthy of any bargeman, thanked his courtiers with a wave of his hand. Then turning to the master, he said something to him that no one else caught, what with all the noise in the room, and which probably was not meant for other ears. And with that he dismissed him. While the courtiers and the army officers stayed behind in the anteroom, Krabbit followed the master out. They left the castle the same way they had come, past the great windows and the mirror-lined walls, through the halls and passageways, down the marble stairs to the gateway, and out onto the steps, where the tall officer still stood, stiff as a poker, eyes opened wide, his hand on the hilt of his dagger. "Free him, Krabbit," said the master. Krabbit had only to snap his fingers in a way he had learned in the Black School. "Off with you," he ordered. "Right about, turn." The officer drew his dagger and saluted with the naked blade. Then he turned right as Krabbit had ordered and marched away. The carriage was waiting for them. on the forecourt of the castle, and the groom assured the master that he had carried out his orders and seen to the bay horses. So I should hope, said the master, and they climbed up on the box. Only now did Crabbit realize he was back in his old clothes again. Well, of course. What would he do with a three-cornered hat, a rapier, and a smart military tunic at the mill? They rattled across the stone bridge over the river Elbe, and once they were out of the city of Dresden and had reached the heights on the other side of the river, the master drove the carriage off the road. The horses rose from the ground again, and home they drove through the air. The moon was in the west, very low already, and it would soon go down. Crabbit was silent, lost in thought. He looked down at the village and little towns as they passed over them in their flight. The fields and woods, ponds and streams, the moorland with its bogs and shadowy, sandy hollow, and all the peaceful countryside lying dark and quiet below them. "What are you thinking of?" asked the master. "I'm thinking of all a man can do with a knowledge of the black art," said Crabbit. "Why, the black art gives you power even over kings and princes." And that's the end of chapter 3.